The conference room fell silent as I watched him walk through the glass doors. Same messy brown hair, same nervous habit of adjusting his tie when he's uncomfortable. But now Marcus Chen was wearing a sharp navy suit instead of the wrinkled t-shirts. I remembered, and he was shaking hands with my business partner like they were old friends. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. 3 years ago, Marcus told me I cared more about spreadsheets than our relationship. That my obsession with building something meaningful would leave me lonely and bitter. He packed his things from our shared apartment in Portland while I was pulling an all-nighter, working on what would eventually become the foundation of my venture capital firm. Now here he was, sitting across from me on the 20th floor of the building I owned, asking for funding for his startup. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I kept my expression neutral as Marcus fumbled with his laptop, trying to get his presentation to work. My business partner, Sarah Williams, shot me a questioning look from across the polished conference table. She knew about Marcus. I'd mentioned him once during a late-night strategy session 2 years ago when we were deciding whether to expand into the Pacific Northwest market. Technical difficulties? I asked, my voice steady despite the way my heart was hammering against my ribs. Marcus looked up, and for a moment, our eyes met. There was recognition there, followed quickly by something that looked like panic. He hadn't known. Somehow, in all his research on Pinnacle Ventures, he'd missed that Alexis Rivera, the woman he'd called too ambitious for her own good, was now the managing partner of one of the most successful early-stage VC firms on the West Coast. I've got it, he said, his voice slightly hoarse. The same voice that used to whisper good morning against my neck when we'd wake up tangled in cheap sheets in our studio apartment near Powell's Books. Sarah cleared her throat. Whenever you're ready, Mr. Chen. We're excited to hear about CloudSync Solutions. The name made me raise an eyebrow. CloudSync, the same concept I'd pitched to him 3 years ago during one of our many late-night conversations about the future of data management. He'd called it unnecessarily complicated back then, suggesting I should focus on more realistic goals. Marcus clicked to his first slide, and I forced myself to focus on the business at hand. Whatever history we had, whatever emotions were churning in my stomach, this was about evaluating an investment opportunity. I'd built Pinnacle Ventures by keeping personal feelings separate from business decisions, and I wasn't about to change that now. CloudSync Solutions addresses the critical gap in real-time data synchronization for small to medium-sized businesses, Marcus began, his presentation voice more polished than I remembered. Currently, 73% of SMBs struggle with data consistency across multiple platforms, leading to an average revenue loss of $15,000 per quarter. The statistics were solid, and despite everything, I found myself leaning forward. This was exactly the kind of problem I'd been passionate about solving back when Marcus and I were together. The kind of problem that kept me up at night, sketching solutions on napkins while he complained about my workaholic tendencies. Our proprietary algorithm reduces synchronization time by 89% compared to existing solutions, Marcus continued, clicking to a slide filled with impressive graphs and charts. We've already secured partnerships with 3 major cloud providers and have a pilot program running with 12 companies in the Portland area. Portland. Of course he'd stayed in Portland. After I moved to San Francisco to pursue my MBA at Stanford, he told me he was happy with simple pleasures and didn't need the constant hustle of Silicon Valley. He'd made it sound like my ambition was a character flaw, something that would eventually consume me and leave me hollow. What's your current revenue model? Sarah asked, making notes on her tablet. We're operating on a SaaS model with 3 tiers, Marcus replied, his confidence growing as he moved through familiar territory. Basic tier at $99 per month, professional at $299, and enterprise at $799. Our customer acquisition cost is currently $127, with an average lifetime value of $3,400. The numbers were impressive, I had to admit. But there was something else nagging at me as I watched him present. The way he described the technical challenges, the specific language he used when explaining the synchronization algorithms, it was almost identical to the way I'd explained these concepts to him years ago. Tell us about your team, I said. Speaking for the first time since the presentation began. Marcus's slide revealed a team of 5 people, including himself as CEO and founder. We have 2 senior developers, a UX designer, a sales specialist, and myself handling strategy and business development. Everyone has equity stakes, and we're all committed to the long-term vision. Impressive, Sarah said. How did you identify this particular problem space? For the first time since he'd started presenting, Marcus hesitated. His eyes flicked to me, then away. I've been interested in data management solutions for several years. Did extensive market research, talked to dozens of potential customers, identified the pain points through direct user feedback. It was a perfectly reasonable answer, but I knew better. Marcus had barely known what cloud computing was when we were together. He'd been working as a graphic designer at a small marketing agency, perfectly content with his modest salary and predictable schedule. The Marcus I'd known had never shown the slightest interest in enterprise software or data synchronization. What inspired you to leave your previous career and pursue this venture? I asked, keeping my tone professional despite the way the question felt loaded with subtext. Another hesitation. I realized I wanted to build something meaningful. Something that could make a real impact on how businesses operate. I got tired of just existing in someone else's vision. The words hit me like a physical blow. They were almost exactly what I'd said to him 3 years ago when I'd tried to explain why I was applying to Stanford, why I wanted to start my own company someday. Back then, he'd rolled his eyes and said I was getting carried away with Silicon Valley fantasies. Sarah was nodding approvingly. That's exactly the kind of founder mindset we look for. Someone who's passionate about solving real problems. Marcus smiled, the same crooked smile that used to make my stomach flip. I learned from someone very driven that ambition isn't a dirty word. It took me a while to understand that wanting more doesn't make you selfish, it makes you human. I felt my jaw clench. Was he seriously going to sit in my conference room and pretend that my ambition had somehow inspired him? After he'd made me feel like a workaholic robot for wanting to build something bigger than myself. Let's talk about your competition, I said, steering the conversation back to safer ground. How do you differentiate from established players like Salesforce and Microsoft? Marcus launched into a detailed competitive analysis, and I had to admit his research was thorough. He'd identified genuine gaps in the market, developed thoughtful positioning strategies, and created a product roadmap that addressed real customer needs. It was good work, the kind of strategic thinking I'd tried to get him interested in when we were together, but as he spoke, I found myself remembering the fights we'd had during those last few months. The way he'd accused me of caring more about my imaginary future company than our actual relationship. How he'd say I was too intense about everything, that I needed to learn to just be present instead of always planning 3 steps ahead. The night he'd finally moved out, I'd been working on a business plan for a data management consultancy, not so different from what Marcus was pitching now. He'd stood in the doorway of our bedroom, holding a box of his things, and said, "This is exactly what I'm talking about, Alexis. It's 2 a.m. and you're still obsessing over spreadsheets. When was the last time we just watched a movie together? When was the last time you asked me about my day?" I'd looked up from my laptop, exhausted and frustrated. "When was the last time you asked me about mine? When was the last time you showed any interest in what I'm trying to build here?" He'd shaken his head. "You're building fantasies, Alex. And you're so caught up in them that you can't see what's real anymore." The memory stung, but I pushed it aside as Marcus wrapped up his presentation. Whatever had happened between us personally, I had a responsibility to evaluate his business objectively. Pinnacle Ventures had investors to answer to, and my personal feelings couldn't factor into investment decisions. "Thank you for the presentation," Sarah said as Marcus closed his laptop. "We'll need some time to discuss internally and do our due diligence. Can you send us your financial projections for the next 3 years, along with references from your current clients?" "Absolutely," Marcus said, standing to shake her hand. Then he turned to me, extending his hand with obvious reluctance. "Alexis." "Marcus." I shook his hand briefly, professionally. His palm was slightly damp with sweat. "I'll walk you out," Sarah offered, but Marcus shook his head. "I can find my way. Thank you both for your time." After he left, Sarah turned to me with raised eyebrows. "So that was interesting." "What do you mean?" "Come on, Alex." The tension in here was thick enough to cut with a knife. "You two have history." I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown San Francisco, watching the evening fog roll in from the bay. "We dated. Briefly. A few years ago." "Briefly?" Sarah joined me at the window. "That didn't look like briefly to me. We lived together for 2 years. It ended badly. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Well, setting aside the personal drama, what did you think of the pitch?" That was the question I'd been dreading. Because despite everything, despite the way Marcus had made me feel like my ambition was a character flaw, despite the way he'd walked out when things got challenging, despite the obvious irony of him now pursuing exactly the kind of venture he'd once dismissed, his business plan was solid. "The market opportunity is real," I said carefully. The technical solution addresses genuine pain points. The team seems capable, and the early traction is promising. But I turned away from the window. But I'm not sure about the founder. Sarah frowned. Really? He seemed passionate, knowledgeable. His background might not be traditional tech, but plenty of successful founders come from other industries. It's not about his background. I paused, trying to figure out how to explain my concerns without revealing too much personal information. I'm just not convinced he's committed to the long-term vision. Building a company requires sustained focus and dedication, especially when things get difficult. I'm not sure he has that kind of persistence. It wasn't entirely untrue. Marcus had always been someone who changed course when challenges arose. When his graphic design clients became demanding, he'd switch agencies. When his band didn't take off immediately, he'd quit music altogether. When our relationship required work and compromise, he'd walked away, but even as I voiced these concerns, I knew they weren't the real reason I was hesitant about the investment. The real reason was sitting in my chest like a stone, heavy and uncomfortable. Marcus had spent 2 years telling me that my ambition was excessive, that my dreams were unrealistic, that I needed to be more grounded and present. He'd made me question whether wanting to build something meaningful made me selfish and obsessive. Now he was sitting in the office I'd built, asking for money to pursue his own ambitious dreams, using language and concepts I'd introduced him to years ago. The hypocrisy was staggering, but what bothered me more was the way he'd positioned himself as someone who'd learned to embrace ambition, as if it had been his idea all along. I think we should pass, I said finally. Sarah looked surprised. Really? The numbers are strong, the market timing is good, and the product demo was impressive. What am I missing? Founder market fit concerns, I said, falling back on venture capital jargon. I'm not confident in the leadership team's ability to execute at scale. It was a reasonable concern, and Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Okay. Should we send the standard rejection email, or do you want to provide more detailed feedback? Standard rejection is fine. But as I said it, I realized I wasn't entirely sure I was making the right decision. Was I passing on a potentially lucrative investment because of legitimate business concerns, or because seeing Marcus again had stirred up emotions I'd thought I'd processed years ago? The next morning, I arrived at the office early and pulled up CloudSync Solutions materials again. In the harsh light of day, removed from the emotional intensity of seeing Marcus, I forced myself to evaluate the opportunity with fresh eyes. The market research was comprehensive. The technical solution was elegant. The early customer feedback was overwhelmingly positive. The financial projections were realistic but optimistic. By every metric we normally use to evaluate early-stage investments, CloudSync Solutions was exactly the kind of company we looked for, but there was still something nagging at me about Marcus's presentation. Not just the personal history between us, but something about the way he described his journey from graphic designer to tech entrepreneur. The timeline didn't quite add up, and some of his technical explanations had sounded rehearsed rather than deeply understood. I opened my laptop and started digging deeper into Marcus's background. LinkedIn showed his transition from graphic design to tech entrepreneur, but the details were vague. His company website listed impressive credentials for his development team, but when I cross-referenced their backgrounds, I found discrepancies. One of his senior developers had actually graduated from a coding bootcamp just 8 months ago. The more I investigated, the more questions arose. Marcus claimed to have spent 2 years researching the market and developing the solution, but I couldn't find any evidence of CloudSync Solutions existing 6 months ago. His claimed partnerships with major cloud providers were nowhere to be found in any public documentation. By noon, I'd uncovered enough inconsistencies to justify my instinct to pass on the investment. But I still couldn't shake the feeling that my decision was being influenced by personal bias. To get an objective perspective, I decided to reach out to some contacts in Portland who might have insights into the local tech scene. The call came at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was reviewing quarterly reports when my assistant buzzed through. There's Jessica Martinez online too. She says she knows you from Stanford and has information about a company you're considering. I didn't recognize the name immediately, but I took the call anyway. Jessica turned out to be a program manager at Intel who'd been in my MBA cohort. We'd worked together on a few group projects but hadn't stayed in close touch after graduation. Alexis, I hope you don't mind me calling. Out of the blue, Jessica said, but I heard through the grapevine that CloudSync Solutions pitched to your firm. My antenna went up immediately. How did you hear that? Marcus Chen reached out to me last week asking for a reference. He mentioned he was in talks with Pinnacle Ventures and wanted to make sure his technical claims would hold up under scrutiny. Interesting. Marcus was smart enough to know we'd do due diligence, but reaching out for references after the pitch suggested he was scrambling to shore up his story. What did he want you to verify? I asked. Jessica's laugh was uncomfortable. That's just it, he wanted me to confirm technical details about data synchronization algorithms that I know for a fact he couldn't have developed himself. The math is graduate-level computer science, but Marcus barely understood basic programming concepts when he was asking me about them 6 months ago. 6 months ago. That timeline aligned with my own investigation findings. He approached you 6 months ago? Yeah, through LinkedIn. Said he was pivoting from design to tech and wanted to pick my brain about enterprise software. I spent maybe 3 hours on video calls explaining market dynamics, technical architectures, that kind of thing. But Alexis, the stuff he was presenting as his own innovation? Those were solutions we discussed during our conversations. My stomach dropped. Are you sure? Positive. I even sent him some academic papers and case studies to help him understand the space better. The competitive analysis he probably showed you? I walked him through most of those companies during our calls. After hanging up with Jessica, I sat in my office staring out at the San Francisco skyline. The pieces were falling into place, but not in a way that made me feel vindicated. Instead, I felt a familiar mixture of disappointment and anger that I remembered from our relationship's final months. Marcus hadn't just stumbled into entrepreneurship. He'd systematically researched how to build a compelling pitch, reached out to experts like Jessica for free consulting, and packaged their insights as his own expertise. It was calculated in a way that the Marcus I'd known had never been, but it was also ambitious in a way that the Marcus I'd known had claimed to despise. I spent the next 2 days making discreet inquiries through my network. The picture that emerged was both impressive and troubling. Marcus had indeed been building cloud sync solutions, but not in the way he'd presented it. Instead of spending 2 years developing proprietary technology, he'd spent 6 months rapidly assembling a team and licensing existing solutions to create what looked like innovation. His senior developers were recent bootcamp graduates, but they were talented and hardworking. His claimed partnerships with cloud providers were actually standard developer API access agreements that any company could obtain. His pilot customers were paying for a service that was essentially a clever integration of existing tools rather than groundbreaking new technology. It wasn't fraud, exactly. But it wasn't the revolutionary startup he'd pitched either. On Thursday morning, Marcus called my office directly. Can we talk? He said without preamble when I answered. I'm listening. Not over the phone. Can you meet me for coffee? There are things I need to explain. I almost said no. We'd already made our decision about the investment, and I didn't see what good could come from a personal conversation. But curiosity won out. Green Cafe on Montgomery Street. 1 hour. The coffee shop was crowded with the usual mix of tech workers and financial district professionals. I arrived first and claimed a corner table, ordering a cordido while I waited. Marcus showed up 10 minutes late, looking haggard in a way that reminded me of our college years when he'd pull all-nighters working on design projects. Thank you for meeting me, he said, sliding into the chair across from me. You have 15 minutes. He winced at my directness but nodded. I know you've been asking questions about CloudSync. I know you found out about Jessica and probably some other things too. So I want to explain why I did it the way I did it. I leaned back in my chair. I'm listening. Marcus stared down at his untouched coffee for a long moment. After you moved to San Francisco, I was angry. Really angry. You'd made this unilateral decision that your career was more important than our relationship, and I felt abandoned. My career wasn't more important than our relationship, Marcus. But it was important to me, and you never seemed to understand that. I understand that now. He looked up at me. But back then, I thought you were chasing something that would never make you happy. I thought if you just focused on what we had, on the life we were building together, you'd realize that was enough. Enough for you, maybe. Yeah, enough for me. He ran his hands through his hair. After you left, I spent about a year being bitter. Telling myself that I'd dodged a bullet, that you'd burn out chasing impossible dreams and end up miserable. I didn't say anything, but I felt my jaw tighten. Then I saw the TechCrunch article about Pinnacle Ventures closing your first fund. $25 million. Your photo in the story, looking confident and successful in a way I'd never seen. You look when we were together. I remembered that article. It had been a career-defining moment, proof that all the late nights and difficult decisions had been worth it. That's when I realized I'd been wrong about everything, Marcus continued. Not just about your ambitions, but about ambition in general. You hadn't burned out or become miserable. You'd become exactly who you'd always said you wanted to be. So you decided to become an entrepreneur? I decided to understand what I'd been missing. He finally took a sip of his coffee. I started reading about startups, taking online courses, and going to meetups. And the more I learned, the more I realized that everything you'd tried to talk to me about during our relationship, market opportunities, scalable business models, disruptive technologies, it was all fascinating. Despite myself, I felt a flicker of the old Marcus I'd fallen for. The one who could become completely absorbed in learning something new. But why the deception, Marcus? Why not just be honest about being new to space? Because I was embarrassed. He looked directly at me for the first time since sitting down. I was embarrassed that it had taken me 3 years to understand what you'd been trying to tell me all along. I was embarrassed that I'd made you feel bad for wanting more out of life. And I was embarrassed that I was now trying to build exactly the kind of company I'd once called a fantasy. I felt something shift in my chest, but I wasn't ready to let him off the hook. So you decided to lie about your expertise and experience? I decided to fake it until I made it, he said. Which I know sounds terrible, but Alexis, the business is real. The customers are real. The problem we're solving is real. I may have started with borrowed knowledge, but I've put in the work to make it my own. Have you? What do you mean? I pulled out my phone and showed him Jessica's LinkedIn profile. Jessica Martinez told me some interesting things about your technical knowledge. Marcus's face went pale. What did she say? That the algorithms you're claiming as proprietary innovation are actually solutions she explained to you 6 months ago. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. She's right. The core synchronization approach came from conversations with her and a few other people I reached out to. But Alex, that's how most successful companies start. Founders identify problems and then figure out solutions by learning from experts, licensing existing technology, combining different approaches in new ways. Most successful companies don't misrepresent their founders' expertise in investor pitches. No, they don't. He looked down at his hands. I screwed up. I should have been upfront about being new to the space. I should have positioned myself as someone who'd identified a market opportunity and assembled the right team to address it, rather than pretending to be a technical expert. The admission surprised me. The Marcus I'd known had rarely acknowledged mistakes so directly. So why didn't you? Because I knew you'd be evaluating the pitch. The words came out in a rush. I knew that if I presented myself as a novice entrepreneur who'd stumbled into a good opportunity, you'd see right through me. You'd know that I was only pursuing this because of what I'd learned from watching your success. I stared at him. You built a company to impress me? I built a company because you inspired me to want more out of life. But yes, part of me hoped that if I could prove I understood what you'd been trying to tell me all those years ago, maybe we could have a conversation about more than just business. The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm, too crowded. I stood up abruptly. I need to go. Alexis, wait. But I was already walking toward the door, my mind reeling from everything Marcus had just revealed. He'd built CloudSync Solutions as some kind of elaborate apology or proof of concept for our failed relationship. The business opportunity was real, but his motivations were completely tangled up in unresolved feelings about our past. As I walked back to my office, I found myself thinking about something my business school professor had said about founder psychology. The best entrepreneurs were driven by a genuine desire to solve problems for customers, not by personal validation or relationship dynamics. Marcus might have stumbled onto a viable business, but his reasons for building it were all wrong. That evening, I called Sarah and filled her in on everything I'd learned. So what do you want to do? She asked when I finished. Stick with our decision to pass. The due diligence concerns were valid, regardless of the personal history. Agreed. But Alex, are you okay? This whole situation sounds emotionally complicated. I looked out my apartment window at the lights of the Bay Bridge. I'm fine. It's just strange seeing someone from your past reinvent themselves so completely. But as I said it, I realized that wasn't entirely true. Marcus hadn't reinvented himself. He'd simply become a version of the person I'd always believed he could be, if only he'd been willing to take risks and push himself beyond his comfort zone. The question was whether that transformation was genuine, or just another form of the same people-pleasing behavior that had made our relationship so frustrating in the first place. 3 weeks after rejecting CloudSync Solutions, I was having lunch with my mentor, Patricia Nguyen, when she dropped a bombshell that made me choke on my salad. I heard you passed on Marcus Chen's company, she said casually, cutting into her salmon. Interesting decision. Patricia was a managing partner at Sequoia Capital and had been instrumental in helping me navigate the venture capital world when I was starting out. She had connections everywhere and seemed to know about every deal happening in Silicon Valley before it was announced. How do you know about that? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Marcus reached out to me last week. He mentioned that Pinnacle had passed and was looking for feedback on how to strengthen his pitch for other investors. My stomach dropped. Other investors? Patricia took another bite, seemingly oblivious. To my distress. He's got meetings lined up with Andreessen Horowitz and Greylock Partners next week. Smart kid, he took the rejection as a learning opportunity rather than getting defensive. I spent the rest of lunch barely contributing to the conversation, my mind racing. If Marcus secured funding from a top-tier firm like A16Z, it would validate everything about his approach. Worse, if CloudSync actually succeeded, I'd have to live with knowing I'd passed on a potentially lucrative investment because of personal bias. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before. I researched a company we'd already rejected. What I found made me question everything I thought I knew about Marcus's business. CloudSync's customer base had grown by 300% in the 3 weeks since our meeting. Their user retention rates were exceptional, 94% month-over-month, which was almost unheard of for early-stage SaaS companies. The customer testimonials on their website were glowing, with specific metrics about time saved and efficiency gained. More importantly, I found evidence that Marcus had been more honest with subsequent investors about his background. A podcast interview from the previous week featured him discussing his transition from graphic design to tech entrepreneurship, acknowledging that he'd learned most of his technical knowledge over the past year through intensive study and mentorship. "I'm not a traditional tech founder," he'd said in the interview. "I came to this space as an outsider who saw a problem that needed solving. What I lack in formal technical training, I make up for with customer obsession and a willingness to learn from people smarter than me." It was exactly the kind of honest positioning I'd wanted to see in his original pitch. The Marcus in this interview sounded confident but humble, ambitious but grounded. It was a version of him I'd never encountered during our relationship or our recent coffee meeting. My phone rang, interrupting my research spiral. It was David Kim, a partner at Greylock whom I'd known since business school. "Alex, I need to ask you about CloudSync Solutions," he said without preamble. "Marcus Chen mentioned that you guys looked at them. Can you tell me why you passed?" This was the conversation I'd been dreading. In the venture capital world, information sharing between firms was common, especially when everyone was trying to avoid costly mistakes. But I couldn't exactly tell David that I'd rejected the deal because my ex-boyfriend had built his company as an elaborate attempt to win me back. "Founder market fit concerns," I said, using the same language I'd given Sarah. "We weren't convinced. The leadership team had the depth of experience necessary to scale in a competitive market." Interesting. That's not the impression I got from our preliminary conversations. The guy seems incredibly well informed about the technical challenges and market dynamics. He's done his homework, I admitted. But there's a difference between research and deep expertise. Fair enough. Though I have to say, his customer traction is impressive. We're seeing organic growth metrics that most companies don't achieve until Series A. After David hung up, I sat in my office feeling increasingly uncomfortable about our decision. Was I letting personal history cloud my judgment about a legitimate business opportunity? Or was my discomfort with Marcus's motivations a valid concern? About founder psychology that other investors were missing, the answer came 2 days later in the form of an email from Tom Rodriguez, one of Marcus's pilot customers. Tom ran a mid-sized logistics company in Portland, and I'd worked with his previous startup during my early days at Pinnacle. He was reaching out to thank me for connecting him with CloudSync Solutions. I hadn't connected him with anything. But I called Tom immediately to understand what he meant. "Marcus mentioned he was working with Pinnacle Ventures," Tom explained. "I figured you'd made the introduction, so I wanted to let you know how happy we are with the service. CloudSync has solved a data consistency problem we've been struggling with for 2 years. What's your experience been like working with Marcus personally?" "Honestly? He's been incredibly responsive and customer-focused. When we identified a bug in the synchronization process, he had his team push a fix within 48 hours. And he's constantly asking for feedback about how to improve the product." This was starting to paint a picture of Marcus that conflicted with both my memories of our relationship and my assumptions about his business practices. The Marcus I'd known had been conflict-averse and tended to avoid difficult conversations. But Tom was describing someone who actively sought out problems and worked aggressively to solve them. "Has he been transparent about the technical limitations of the platform?" I asked. "Very much so. In fact, he was upfront about the fact that some of the underlying technology is licensed rather than built in-house. But he explained how they've integrated everything in a way that's specifically designed for our use case." After talking to Tom, I reached out to 2 other CloudSync customers. Both told similar stories. Marcus had been honest about the platform's capabilities and limitations, extremely responsive to their needs, and focused on delivering real value rather than overselling his technology. It was becoming clear that whatever Deception Marcus had engaged in during his pitch to us, he wasn't misleading his actual customers. If anything, he seemed to have learned from our rejection and adjusted his approach to be more authentic with subsequent stakeholders. That evening, I found myself doing something I hadn't done since business school, second-guessing a major decision. I pulled up CloudSync's materials again and tried to evaluate them with fresh eyes, setting aside everything I knew about Marcus personally. The market opportunity was still compelling. The early traction was still impressive. The customer feedback was overwhelmingly positive. The technology, while not revolutionary, solved real problems for real businesses. The only red flag was Marcus himself, and increasingly, I was wondering if that red flag was based on who he used to be rather than who he was becoming. My internal debate was interrupted by a text message from an unknown number. Alex, this is Marcus. I know you're probably tired of hearing from me, but I have a proposal that might interest you. Can we talk? I stared at the message for 10 minutes before responding. What kind of proposal? His reply came immediately, the kind that might solve both of our problems. Meet me at the office tomorrow at 6 p.m. I'll explain everything. Against my better judgment, I agreed. But as I set my phone down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to make either the smartest or the stupidest decision of my career. The next day dragged by impossibly slowly. I found myself checking CloudSync's website multiple times, reading customer testimonials and trying to understand what I might be missing. Sarah noticed my distraction during our afternoon portfolio review. You're thinking about the CloudSync thing again, aren't you? She said. Maybe. Alex, we made the right decision based on the information we had. You can't second-guess every investment that doesn't work out. But what if it does work out? What if we passed on a legitimate opportunity because I let personal bias influence my judgment? Sarah leaned back in her chair. Then we learn from it and make better decisions going forward. But you can't let one ex-boyfriend turn you into an indecisive investor. She was right, but that didn't make the uncertainty any easier to bear. At 5:45 p.m., I took the elevator down to the lobby to wait for Marcus, still not sure what I was hoping to accomplish. He arrived exactly on time, carrying a tablet and looking more nervous than I'd seen him since our original meeting. We rode the elevator to the 20th floor in silence, and I led him to the same conference room where he'd first pitched CloudSync. So what's this proposal? I asked as we sat down. Marcus opened his tablet and slid it across the table. On the screen was a detailed employment offer from Pinnacle Ventures. I want to come work for you, he said simply. I stared at the employment offer on Marcus's tablet, convinced I'd misunderstood something fundamental about the situation. You want to abandon your startup to come work for the firm that just rejected you? Not abandon. Transition. Marcus leaned forward, his expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. Alex, I've spent the last month thinking about our conversation at the coffee shop and your decision to pass on CloudSync. You were right about my motivations being tangled up in personal stuff. So you're giving up? I'm pivoting. He gestured to the tablet. I've been talking to acquisition specialists about selling CloudSync to a larger company that can scale it properly. The customer base and technology are solid, but you made me realize I'm not the right person to be CEO of a high-growth startup. This conversation was taking turns I hadn't anticipated. What makes you think you'd be right for venture capital? Because I understand what it's like to be on the other side of the table now. I know what founders are thinking when they walk into these rooms, what they're hoping for, what they're afraid of. Marcus pulled up another document on his tablet. More importantly, I've identified systematic gaps in how early-stage companies are being evaluated. Despite myself, I was intrigued. What kind of gaps? Most VCs focus heavily on technical innovation and market size, but there's not enough emphasis on founder psychology and customer obsession. You rejected CloudSync partly because you sensed my motivations were wrong, but you couldn't articulate specific criteria for evaluating founder mindset. He wasn't wrong. Venture capital had always struggled with the soft skills aspect of due diligence. I spent the last 3 weeks interviewing other founders who've been through the fundraising process, Marcus continued. The patterns are fascinating. Companies with genuinely customer-obsessed founders consistently outperform those with technically brilliant founders who are building solutions looking for problems. That's not exactly a revolutionary insight, Marcus. No, but most firms don't have systematic ways to identify customer obsession during the due diligence process. I think I could help develop better evaluation frameworks. I found myself looking at Marcus with new eyes. The person sitting across from me was making strategic arguments about venture capital methodology, not romantic appeals about our shared history. It was the kind of analytical thinking I'd tried to cultivate in him years ago. Walk me through your transition plan for CloudSync, I said. Marcus's presentation was methodical and well-researched. He'd already identified 3 potential acquirers who were actively looking for data management solutions to bolt onto their existing platforms. The conversations were preliminary, but the interest was genuine. My development team is strong enough to continue building the product under new ownership, he explained. And I've documented all the customer relationships and technical specifications so the transition would be smooth. What's your expected timeline? 6 to 8 weeks for the sale to close, assuming we can agree on terms with one of the interested parties. I studied the financial projections he'd prepared. The acquisition valuations weren't spectacular, but they were reasonable given CloudSync's early stage. More importantly, Marcus had structured the deal so his team would retain equity stakes and employment with the acquiring company. This seems well thought out, I admitted. But why Pinnacle specifically? There are larger firms with more resources. Because working here would let me learn from someone I respect while contributing something meaningful to the evaluation process. Marcus met my eyes directly. And because I think we could be incredibly effective business partners, even if we can't be anything else. The honesty of that statement hit me harder than I'd expected. For the first time since he'd walked back into my life, Marcus was being completely straightforward about his intentions. I need to discuss this with Sarah, I said finally. Of course. But Alex, there's one more thing. Marcus pulled up a final document. I want you to know that 3 different firms have made offers to fund CloudSync's next round. Greylock offered the best terms, $3.2 million at a $12 million pre-money valuation. My stomach dropped. And I turned them all down because I realized you were right. I wasn't building CloudSync for the right reasons, and that would have caught up with me eventually. He closed the tablet. Better to sell the company to someone who can execute the vision properly and focus on what I'm actually good at. After Marcus left, I sat in the conference room for 20 minutes trying to process everything that had just happened. The Marcus I'd known 3 years ago would never have walked away from a $3.2 million funding offer to pursue what was essentially an entry-level position at a venture capital firm, but then again, the Marcus I'd known 3 years ago would never have built a successful startup in the first place. Sarah found me there an hour later, staring out at the city lights. Rough day, she asked, settling into the chair Marcus had vacated. Marcus wants to work here. Sarah raised an eyebrow. As what? I explained Marcus's proposal, including his plan to sell CloudSync and his ideas about improving founder evaluation processes. Sarah listened without interrupting, taking notes on her phone. It's not the craziest idea I've ever heard, she said when I finished. We have been talking about bringing on someone to focus on operational due diligence. And having a founder's perspective could be valuable. But hiring your ex-boyfriend is complicated in ways that go way beyond professional considerations. She was right, but I found myself playing devil's advocate. What if we can separate the personal stuff from the business opportunity? Can we? Can you? Sarah leaned forward. Alex, you've been obsessing over this CloudSync situation for a month. That's not like you. Usually when we pass on a deal, you move on immediately. This situation is different. Exactly. And that's why hiring Marcus could be a mistake. Your judgment about him is compromised by your history together. I wanted to argue, but Sarah's concerns were valid. The venture capital world was small and intensely relationship-driven. If things went badly with Marcus, it could affect not just our personal dynamics but Pinnacle's reputation in the ecosystem. On the other hand, Sarah continued, if Marcus has genuinely transformed himself from the person you described from your relationship, he could bring a unique perspective to early-stage investing. So what do you think we should do? I think we should treat this like any other hiring decision. Forget the personal history and evaluate Marcus purely on his qualifications and potential contribution to the firm. The next morning, I called Patricia Nguyen to get an outside perspective on Marcus's transformation. I've been wondering when you'd call about this, Patricia said when I explained the situation. I had a feeling there was more to your CloudSync rejection than founder market fit concerns. What did you think of Marcus when he reached out to you? Impressive, actually. He asked thoughtful questions about how to position himself for different types of investors. And he was surprisingly insightful about the gaps between what founders think VCs want to hear versus what we actually need to evaluate. Do you think he'd be good at venture capital? Patricia was quiet for a moment. The best investors I know have 2 qualities, intellectual humility and genuine curiosity about how businesses work. Marcus demonstrated both during our conversation. Whether he has the other skills, pattern recognition, relationship building, portfolio management, remains to be seen. But those can be taught. They can. The question is whether you're the right person to teach them. That afternoon, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called Marcus and asked him to come in for a formal interview with our entire investment team. If he was serious about working in venture capital, he needed to prove himself to more than just me. The interview was scheduled for the following week, which gave me time to prepare questions that would test his analytical thinking and investment judgment. I also reached out to 2 of his CloudSync customers to verify his claims about customer obsession and responsiveness. Both conversations reinforced what I'd already learned. Marcus had become genuinely skilled at identifying customer needs and developing solutions to address them. More importantly, he'd shown the kind of intellectual flexibility that successful investors needed, the ability to change his mind when presented with new information. The night before Marcus's interview, I found myself thinking about something my business school professor had said about career transitions. The most successful pivots happened when people leveraged existing skills in new contexts rather than trying to completely reinvent themselves. Marcus's experience building CloudSync had taught him about customer development, market validation, and operational execution. Those were exactly the skills that venture capitalists needed to evaluate early-stage companies effectively. But as I prepared for the interview, I couldn't shake Sarah's warning about compromised judgment. Was I considering Marcus because he'd genuinely developed relevant skills, or because I was impressed by his transformation from the person who'd once criticized my ambition into someone who now embodied it himself? The answer to that question would determine not just Marcus's future at Pinnacle Ventures, but whether I'd learned to separate personal feelings from professional decisions, the same challenge that had ended our relationship 3 years earlier. The interview was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Thursday, but Marcus arrived 30 minutes early and spent the time in our lobby reviewing what looked like detailed notes on every company in our portfolio. I watched him through the glass partition, noting how he'd trade his nervous fidgeting for the focused intensity one remembered from his best design work. Our conference room filled with the 4 partners who would evaluate Marcus, myself, Sarah, our technical partner Kevin Wong, and our operations specialist Lauren Chen. I deliberately structured this as a traditional investment committee meeting, complete with the formal presentation setup that would make any candidate nervous. Before we begin, Kevin said, settling into his chair, I want to understand why you're interested in venture capital specifically. Most successful founders double down on building companies, not evaluating them. Marcus had clearly anticipated this question. 2 reasons. First, I discovered that I'm better at identifying market opportunities and assessing founder potential than I am at scaling operations. Second, I want to help other entrepreneurs avoid the mistakes I made during my own fundraising process. What mistakes? Lauren asked. Overcomplicating the technology story when I should have focused on customer value. Misrepresenting my own expertise instead of highlighting my team's strengths. Most importantly, building a company for the wrong reasons initially. Kevin leaned forward. Elaborate on that last point. I started CloudSync partly to prove something to myself and others, rather than purely to solve customer problems. That kind of founder psychology creates long-term issues that are hard to detect during due diligence. I found myself impressed. Despite my intention to remain neutral, Marcus was voluntarily admitting to exactly the concerns I'd raised about his motivations. Walk us through how you'd evaluate a company similar to CloudSync, Sarah said, sliding a mock pitch deck across the table. The fictional company was called Dataflow Solutions, and it bore striking similarities to Marcus's actual startup. I watched carefully as he reviewed the materials, looking for signs that he'd recognize the parallel. Interesting market opportunity, Marcus said after several minutes. The technical approach is sound, and the customer traction looks promising. But I'd want to dig deeper into the founder's background and motivations. What specifically would you investigate? Lauren asked. First, I'd verify the founder's technical claims through back-channel references with industry experts. Second, I'd interview existing customers to understand their actual experience with the product versus what's being promised. Third, I'd assess whether the founder is genuinely passionate about this problem space or just pursuing a perceived market opportunity. Kevin nodded approvingly. How would you structure that assessment? Customer interviews are the most revealing. I'd ask about response times when issues arise, how the founder handles difficult feedback, and whether they demonstrate deep understanding of customer workflows. Founders who are truly customer-obsessed will have specific stories about going above and beyond to solve problems. It was exactly the kind of framework I'd wished we'd had when evaluating CloudSync originally. Marcus was essentially designing a process to identify his own previous weaknesses. Let's switch gears, I said, taking control of the conversation. Tell us about a time when you had to make a difficult decision that went against popular opinion. Marcus was quiet for a moment, and I could see him weighing how honest to be. 3 weeks ago, I turned down multiple funding offers for CloudSync, including one from Greylock Partners that would have valued the company at $12 million. Why? Sarah asked. Because I realized the investors were betting on market opportunity and early traction, not on my ability to scale the business effectively. Taking their money would have been taking advantage of their incomplete assessment of my capabilities as a CEO. Lauren looked skeptical. That's an expensive decision based on self-awareness. It was the right decision for everyone involved. Greylock would have eventually figured out that I wasn't the right founder to scale CloudSync, and the correction would have been painful for all stakeholders. Better to be honest upfront and find a path that actually serves the customers and technology. Kevin pulled up something on his laptop. I did some research on your customer retention metrics. 94% month-over-month is exceptional for an early-stage company. What's driving that performance? Obsessive focus on customer success over feature development. Instead of building new capabilities, we spent most of our resources ensuring that existing functionality worked perfectly for our users' specific workflows. That's operationally intensive, Lauren pointed out. How did you manage the economics? By staying small and saying no to customers whose needs didn't align with our core capabilities. We turned down probably 40% of potential clients. Because we knew we couldn't serve them effectively. I was starting to understand why other VCs had been interested in funding CloudSync. Marcus had built exactly the kind of sustainable, customer-focused business that experienced investors looked for. His decision to sell rather than scale was looking increasingly sophisticated rather than defeatist. Final question, I said. If you were evaluating Pinnacle Ventures as a potential employer, what concerns would you have? Marcus smiled for the first time during the interview. Whether the managing partner can separate personal history from professional evaluation. And whether the firm's culture would support someone learning the investment business while contributing operational insights. The directness of his answer caught everyone off guard. Sarah actually laughed. Fair enough. Any other concerns? Whether I'd be hired as a genuine contributor or as some kind of redemption project. I'm interested in building a career in venture capital, not resolving personal relationships through professional proximity. After Marcus left, the four of us spent an hour debating his candidacy. Kevin was enthusiastic about his customer-focused approach and analytical thinking. Lauren appreciated his operational experience and willingness to acknowledge weaknesses. Sarah remained concerned about the personal complications but admitted his interview performance had been impressive. What's your read, Alex? Kevin asked finally. I'd been dreading this moment all week. He's qualified for the role and would bring valuable perspective to our evaluation process. The question is whether hiring him creates more complications than benefits. Complications for the firm or complications for you? Lauren asked gently. Both. Sarah leaned back in her chair. Here's what I'm thinking. Marcus clearly has relevant skills and insights. But Alex, if we hire him, you need to be his manager and mentor. That puts you in the position of either being too hard on him to prove you're not showing favoritism or too easy on him because of guilt about your past relationship. There's a third option, Kevin said. We could structure his role so that he reports to me initially, with clearly defined objectives and evaluation criteria. It was a reasonable suggestion, but it felt like an admission that I couldn't handle the situation professionally. Give me 24 hours to think about it, I said finally. That evening, I did something I rarely allowed myself. I called my former business school roommate Emma Rodriguez for personal advice. Emma had built her own consulting firm and had experience navigating complex professional relationships. The question isn't whether Marcus is qualified, Emma said after I explained the situation. The question is whether you can work with him without it affecting your judgment about other investments and team dynamics. I think I can. You think, or you know? I was quiet for a long moment. I think seeing him succeed at CloudSync actually made it easier to separate our personal history from his professional capabilities. He's not the same person I dated 3 years ago. Are you the same person who dated him 3 years ago? That was the question I'd been avoiding. The truth was, I'd grown and changed as much as Marcus had. The insecure woman who'd needed validation for her ambitions had been replaced by someone confident in her own judgment and achievements. No, I said finally. I'm not. Then maybe the real question is whether you can both be professionals about this, not whether he's qualified for the job. The next morning, I called Marcus before our team meeting. I have an offer for you, I said without preamble. 6-month trial period as an associate, reporting to Kevin Wong. Standard compensation package for your experience level. Clear performance metrics and evaluation criteria. And after 6 months? If it works out, we will discuss a permanent position and potential reporting structure changes. If it doesn't work out, we part ways professionally with no hard feelings. Marcus was quiet. For a moment. What made you decide to take the risk? Because you've convinced me that you're genuinely committed to building a career in venture capital, not resolving our personal history. And because I think you could make us better investors. Thank you. I won't let you down. Don't thank me yet. Venture capital is harder than building startups. Ask me in 6 months if I still think this was a good idea. But as I hung up the phone, I realized I was looking forward to finding out the answer to that question. For the first time since Marcus had walked back into my life, I felt like we were both exactly where we were supposed to be. 4 months into Marcus's trial period, I was reviewing his performance metrics when Sarah knocked on my office door with an expression I couldn't read. We need to talk about the Morrison Tech deal, she said, closing the door behind her. Morrison Tech was a cybersecurity startup that had been pitched to us 3 weeks earlier by founders who seemed impressive on paper but had struck me as overly aggressive during their presentation. The team had pushed back on every question we'd asked and dismissed concerns about their burn rate as typical VC conservatism. What about it? I asked, though I suspected I knew where this conversation was heading. Marcus was right. Again. Sarah sat down across from my desk. I just got off the phone with their former CTO, who quit 2 weeks after their pitch to us. Apparently there's been significant turnover, questionable financial reporting, and the product demo they showed us was essentially vaporware. This was the 3rd time in 4 months that Marcus had identified red flags in a company that other firms had funded. His framework for evaluating founder psychology was proving remarkably accurate at predicting which startups would implode despite impressive initial metrics. How did he spot the problems when we missed them? I asked. He insisted on doing reference calls with former employees, not just current team members. Turns out the CTO had been trying to raise concerns about the company's direction for months before finally leaving. I pulled up Marcus's evaluation notes from the Morrison Tech pitch. His assessment had been detailed and damning. Founders exhibit defensive behavior patterns when challenged. Financial projections assume unrealistic customer acquisition rates. Technical demo appears to showcase features that don't yet exist. Recommend pass based on leadership concerns. At the time, Kevin and I had thought Marcus was being overly cautious. The founders had strong backgrounds, impressive early customers, and a compelling market opportunity. But Marcus had pushed for deeper due diligence, particularly around team dynamics and product development timelines. There's something else, Sarah continued. Benchmark Capital funded Morrison Tech last week at a $15 million valuation. They're going to lose their entire investment when this thing collapses. How confident are you about that timeline? Very. The former CTO thinks they have maybe 6 weeks of runway left, and their customer acquisition strategy is built on features that don't actually work. I leaned back in my chair, processing what this meant. Marcus hadn't just helped us avoid a bad investment, he'd potentially saved us from a catastrophic loss that would have damaged our reputation with limited partners. We should probably discuss his permanent employment status, Sarah said. Already scheduled for next week. But as Sarah left my office, I realized the conversation about Marcus's future at Pinnacle would be more complicated than either of us had anticipated. His performance had exceeded every expectation, but not in ways I'd predicted. Marcus had become our most effective due diligence specialist, not because he understood technology better than Kevin or markets better than Lauren, but because he approached founder evaluation with the pattern recognition of someone who had experienced both success and failure firsthand. He could identify self-deception, overconfidence, and misaligned motivations in ways that traditional investors couldn't. More importantly, he'd developed into exactly the kind of colleague I'd always wanted to work with, intellectually rigorous, professionally focused, and completely committed to making better investment decisions. Our personal history had become irrelevant to our working relationship. The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 years ago, Marcus had criticized my ambition as excessive and unrealistic. Now he was using those same ambitious instincts to build a successful career in one of the most competitive industries in the world. That evening, I found myself working late again, reviewing portfolio company updates in the same conference room where Marcus had first pitched CloudSync. The parallel struck me as significant. I was still the person who stayed late obsessing over business details, but now I was working alongside someone who understood that obsession rather than resenting it. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. CloudSync acquisition finalized today. Final purchase price was $4.2 million. Team retained equity and employment. Thanks for the advice on structuring the deal. I smiled, remembering our conversation 6 weeks earlier when Marcus had asked for guidance on negotiating the acquisition terms. He'd approached it with the same analytical thoroughness he brought to investment evaluation, ultimately securing a better outcome for his team than his initial expectations. The next morning brought news that would test Marcus's professional judgment in an unexpected way. David Kim from Greylock called to tell me that Morrison Tech was looking for bridge funding after their initial investor had become concerned about burn rate issues. "Are you guys interested in taking a look?" David asked. "I know you passed on them previously, but they're claiming to have addressed the operational concerns." "Send over their updated materials," I said. "We'll evaluate them with fresh eyes." After hanging up, I walked over to Marcus's desk. He'd been working on a competitive analysis of enterprise software companies, surrounded by the kind of detailed charts and graphs that reminded me of his CloudSync presentation. "Morrison Tech is looking for bridge funding," I told him. "Greylock wants to know if we're interested in reconsidering." Marcus looked up from his laptop. "Are we?" "That depends on whether you think they've actually addressed the fundamental issues you identified." "They haven't." Marcus pulled up a news article on his screen. Their former CTO started a blog post series about startup leadership failures last week. He doesn't mention Morrison Tech by name, but the examples he uses are clearly based on his experience there. I read the blog post over Marcus's shoulder. It described a company where founders ignored technical feedback, misrepresented product capabilities to investors, and created a culture where dissenting opinions were discouraged. The details aligned perfectly with Marcus's original assessment. "How do you want to respond to David?" Marcus asked. "You tell me. It's your call." Marcus was quiet for a moment, and I could see him working through the implications. Recommending against a deal that another firm was considering could damage relationships if we were wrong. But recommending a deal we believed would fail was worse. "We should pass again and explain why," he said finally. "David deserves to understand the risks he's taking, even if Greylock decides to proceed anyway." It was exactly the kind of principled decision-making that had made Marcus valuable to our team. He'd learned to balance relationship management with investment judgment in ways that protected both our portfolio and our reputation. 6 months after Marcus joined Pinnacle Ventures, I was preparing for our annual limited partner meeting when Kevin knocked on my office door. "The LP presentation looks great," he said, "but I think we should add a section about our enhanced due diligence processes." "What kind of section?" "Marcus's founder evaluation framework has helped us avoid 3 potential disasters this year. That's the kind of operational improvement that limited partners care about." He was right. Marcus had become integral to our investment process in ways that went beyond his individual deal evaluations. His frameworks were being adopted by our entire team, and our overall investment performance had improved measurably. "Include a case study on the Morrison Tech analysis," I suggested. "Show how enhanced founder psychology assessment prevented a significant loss." "Already drafted." Marcus helped me put together the analysis. That afternoon, I asked Marcus to join me for coffee, not at the crowded shop where we'd had our difficult conversation months earlier, but at a quiet place near our office where we could talk about his future at Pinnacle. "Your 6-month review is outstanding," I told him as we sat down. "Kevin wants to promote you to principal and have you lead our operational due diligence practice." Marcus nodded slowly. "That sounds like an amazing opportunity. But I want to make sure this is about professional merit, not personal history." I'd been expecting this concern. "Marcus, if this were about personal history, I would have hired you immediately and avoided all the performance metrics and team evaluation. The fact that you've had to prove yourself over 6 months is exactly the proof that this is about professional capability." "Fair point." Marcus took a sip of his coffee. "In that case, I accept the promotion." "Good. Because there's one more thing." I pulled out a tablet and showed him our latest portfolio company dashboard. We're leading a Series A round for a data synchronization startup that looks remarkably similar to CloudSync. Marcus studied the materials with the same intensity he brought to all his investment evaluations. "SyncFlow Technologies. Interesting. How did they address the scalability challenges that CloudSync faced?" "That's what I want you to help us figure out." "Think you can evaluate a company in your former market space objectively?" Marcus smiled, the same crooked smile I remembered from years ago, but now accompanied by the confidence that came from professional success rather than personal insecurity. "I think I can manage that." As we walked back to the office together, I realized that Marcus had become exactly the kind of person I'd always hoped he could be, someone who channeled his intelligence and analytical skills toward building something meaningful, someone who understood that ambition was a tool for creating value rather than a character flaw to be suppressed. The transformation hadn't happened because of our relationship or in spite of it. It had happened because Marcus had finally found the courage to pursue the same kind of purposeful work that had always driven me. 3 years ago, he'd told me I was too ambitious for my own good. Now we were partners in one of the most ambitious Industries in the world, working together to identify and support the next generation of transformative companies. The irony was perfect, but more importantly, it was profitable. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.